The rain had been falling for 6 hours, and Rowan Voss had stopped counting the minutes between thunderclaps around hour 4. He sat on the edge of a narrow cot in a cabin that smelled of gun oil, cold coffee, and the particular mustiness of a man who no longer bothered opening curtains he couldn't see anyway. His left hand rested on his knee, fingers curled inward, the knuckles pale under the skin, gripping nothing, gripping the memory of a leash that hadn't been there in 3 years. The storm outside wasn't loud. It was the absence between the thunder that got him. The long, dragging silence where his ruined ears strained for a sound that would never come, and his mind, treacherous and precise, filled the gap with other silences. A silence in a stairwell in Fallujah, a silence after an explosion that had taken his sight and left him, inexplicably, breathing. He had a bottle on the table, 3/4 empty. He hadn't decided yet whether to finish it or throw it against the wall he could no longer see. That was when the sound came. Not thunder, something lower, wetter, dragging. A scrape of something against gravel, out past the porch, past the tree line his memory still charted in the dark. Rowan's spine straightened by degrees, vertebra by vertebra, the way it used to when a patrol went quiet at the wrong moment. His breath, which had been slow and shallow and half-drunk, went suddenly narrow and fast, a bellows working too hard in too small a space. His jaw tightened. Somewhere under the storm, under the ringing in his damaged ears that never fully stopped, there was a rhythm, uneven, dragging, alive. He told himself it was a branch. He told himself it was nothing. He reached for the cane by the door anyway, and his fingers, the same fingers that had once field-stripped a rifle in the dark without thinking, fumbled twice against the handle before closing around it. Twice. He noted that. He noted everything now. Noting was the only control he had left. The porch boards were slick and cold under bare feet, and the rain came sideways, needling his face. And for one long, suspended second, Rowan Voss stood at the edge of his own steps, with nothing ahead of him but blackness and noise, and a sound that would not stop dragging itself closer through the mud. And something in him, some old and buried instinct that had survived the blast and the silence and the bottle, told him this was not a branch, and this was not nothing, and in exactly the next few minutes, whatever was crawling toward his porch in the storm would change everything he thought he had left to lose. But what the dog did next shocked everyone. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Kindness and K9 Legends. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Morning arrived the way it always did for Rowan Voss. Not as light, but as temperature. A faint warmth against his eyelids that told him the sun had cleared the tree line, nothing more. He had learned, in 3 years of permanent dark, to read the day through everything except sight, the particular creak of the second floorboard from the bed, the way the air in the kitchen carried a colder edge than the air in the hallway, the exact number of steps, 11, between the nightstand and the bathroom door, a number he had memorized so completely that his body now walked it without his mind's permission. He did not reach for a light switch. He never did. There was a small, bitter comfort in that. In living in a house where darkness cost him nothing, where he was not, for once, the only one who couldn't see. The rituals began the moment his feet touched the floor. Everything had a place, and everything had to remain in that place. Because a misplaced boot or a chair, pulled 6 inches from where it belonged, was not an inconvenience to Rowan. It was a hazard, a hole in the map he carried instead of eyes. He ran his palm along the wall as he walked, fingertips grazing the same worn groove in the plaster, a groove his own hand had carved over hundreds of repetitions. 3 steps to the counter. Coffee tin, second shelf, always turned so the seam of the lid faced east, a detail no one else would ever notice, a detail that meant everything. He made his coffee in silence, because silence was the only environment he could fully trust. Sound, for Rowan, was treacherous now. The damaged nerves in his ears turned ordinary noises into unpredictable things, a dropped spoon becoming, for one terrible half-second, indistinguishable from something sharper, something that used to precede fire. He had learned to move through his own kitchen like a man diffusing something delicate, slow, deliberate. No sudden reaches. The isolation was not an accident. It was architecture. He had chosen this cabin for its distance from the nearest neighbor, 11 minutes by truck, a fact he'd measured once and never needed to measure again, because distance meant fewer voices, fewer questions, fewer well-meaning hands that reached for his elbow without asking first. People in town still remembered him, vaguely, as the Marine who'd come back wrong. He preferred it that way. Vague was survivable. Known was not. There was a chair on the porch that he never sat in. It faced the yard, faced a low wooden post he had installed himself 2 years ago and refused, even now, to explain to anyone who asked. He kept a length of leather leash coiled beside the door, on a hook at exactly shoulder height, and he could not have said, would not have said if asked, why he had never taken it down. His left hand found its way there most mornings, resting against the coiled leather for 3-4 seconds, no more. Then it withdrew, and the fingers curled shut, and the knuckles went white with the effort of holding something that was not, technically, being held at all. He told himself it was habit. He told himself a great many things were habit. The truth, buried somewhere beneath the routines and the measured steps and the coffee tin turned just so, was simpler and heavier than habit. Rowan Voss had survived something that had not let his squad's K9 survive, and no amount of architecture, no cabin, no distance, no 11 exact steps to the bathroom door, had yet found a way to make that arithmetic bearable. He was a man who had built an entire life out of controlling what he could touch, precisely because there remained one thing, unreachable and unforgivable, that he could not. He did not yet know that somewhere beyond the tree line, in the wet dark of the previous night's storm, that arithmetic had already begun, quietly and without his permission, to change. The dragging sound had not stopped by the time Rowan reached the bottom step, and that was the detail that unmade every excuse he had prepared on the way down. A branch does not pause. A branch does not, upon hearing footsteps, go suddenly, deliberately still. He stood in the mud with the cane held low and useless at his side, rain running in cold ropes down the collar of his shirt, and he listened, the way he had once listened for tripwires, not with his ears alone, but with the whole surface of his skin. Nothing. Then, off to his left, low to the ground, a sound he knew in his body before his mind had finished naming it. Breath. Ragged, effortful, drawn through a throat that was working too hard for the size of the animal producing it. His feet moved before his judgment caught up. 3 steps off the porch line, into wet grass that swallowed his ankles, cane sweeping the dark in short, controlled arcs, and then the tip of it struck something that was not wood, not stone, something that flinched. The growl that answered was low and continuous, a sound built entirely out of warning, and underneath it, unmistakably, a whimper it could not fully suppress. Pain leaking through the threat like water through a cracked hull. Rowan went still, every muscle in him locked into the old, practiced stillness of a man who has learned that sudden movement gets people killed. And for one long, suspended breath, he was not in a Virginia field in the rain. He was in a stairwell half a world away, on his knees, with dust falling from the ceiling in a slow gray curtain, and a sound in his ears that his brain, 20 years old and desperate, had refused to identify as anything other than what it was, his team's dog, 30 feet away, not answering the call. The growl came again, closer now, and it dragged him back into his own body with the force of a slammed door. He lowered himself slowly to his knees in the mud. Cain laid aside, both hands raised, though there was no one to see the gesture, but the animal in front of him. "Easy," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, worn thin by disuse. "Easy, I'm not—" He stopped himself. He had no idea what he wasn't. He only knew what the sound in front of him was. A body in distress, breathing in the shallow, rapid pattern of something that had been hurt, and had not yet decided whether he was the thing that had done it. He extended one hand, palm down, low to the ground, the way he'd been trained to approach canines that weren't his own, a lifetime ago, in a different uniform, in a different version of himself that hadn't yet lost the right to that kind of closeness. His fingers met wet fur first, matted and cold, and beneath it, the unmistakable heat of an open wound along the ribs. The animal's whole body went rigid under his palm, not fleeing, not yet, but coiled, every muscle deciding in real time whether this hand was the kind that helped or the kind that hurt. The growling did not stop, but it did not deepen either. Rowan's own breath was coming fast now, too fast, his chest tight in the old, familiar way that meant the last 3 years were losing their grip on the last 20 minutes. He forced air out slowly through his nose, a technique a VA counselor had given him once and that he'd never admitted to using, and made himself speak again, quieter this time, less a command than an offering. "I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't know if that was true in any way the animal could understand. He only knew he needed it to be true. Something shifted beneath his hand, not surrender. Rowan would not have called it that, not then, not ever, but a fractional easing. A single inch of tension bled out of a frame that had clearly forgotten or never learned that such easing was survivable. The growl thinned into something closer to breath. Beneath his palm, along the ribs, his fingers found the raised, unmistakable ridge of an old scar. Long-healed, deliberate, the kind of scar that came from a blade or a burn and not from an accident. His hand went still over it. Somewhere behind his ruined eyes, in the dark that was permanent now, an old and terrible arithmetic stirred back to life. A scar in that exact place, on that exact side, described once in a report he had read 100 times and had never been able to stop reading. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself a great many things meant nothing. The animal, exhausted, wet, and bleeding, let its head drop against his knee, and Rowan Voss knelt in the mud at 3 a.m, with his hand resting on a stranger's wound, and did not move again until the storm began, finally, to break. He carried the dog inside, because there was no version of the night that ended any other way, though every step back toward the cabin cost him something he didn't have a name for. The animal was heavier than its frame suggested, dead weight folded against his chest, and twice on the walk back Rowan's arms shook, not from the effort, but from the sheer, unbearable familiarity of the shape he was carrying. He set it down on a folded blanket near the stove and did not examine why he still owned a blanket meant for exactly this purpose. The growling returned the moment his hands moved toward the wound. It was not the low, warning register of the yard. This was sharper, higher, a sound with teeth already in it, and Rowan froze with his fingers an inch from matted fur, his own pulse suddenly loud in his ruined ears. He heard, rather than saw, the scrape of claws against the floorboards as the animal dragged itself backward, putting distance between them. Its spine curved into a shape that had nothing to do with the injury, and everything to do with a decision it had clearly made before Rowan ever found it. Bodies that reach do not get trusted twice. "I need to look at it," he said, and heard how useless the words were, even as he said them. Reason did not translate. He knew that. He had once been on the receiving end of exactly this kind of unreasonable, animal refusal to be helped, back when help had felt indistinguishable from harm. He tried again, slower, and this time the growl deepened into something with a warning shape to it. A single sharp exhale through the nose, gums drawn back far enough that Rowan could hear the change in the sound the air made passing over teeth. He stopped. He had spent 2 decades learning to read threat assessments in the dark, and he did not need his eyes to understand that the next inch forward would be answered. So he sat back instead, cross-legged on his own kitchen floor, and did nothing. Minutes passed. He counted them the way he counted everything now, not out of impatience, but because counting was the only leash he had left to hold onto his own breathing, which had gone thin and quick again, catching high in his chest, the way it always did in small rooms, with something unpredictable in them. His left hand, without his permission, curled tight against his knee, knuckles whitening, gripping nothing. The dog's breathing was doing something similar, rapid, shallow, a body running calculations it couldn't voice. Is this the kind of stillness that precedes a hand, or the kind that precedes a kick? Its claws kept working against the floor in small, involuntary movements, gouging thin, pale lines into wood that had never been scratched before, and every few seconds a low sound rose in its throat and died there, half-formed, swallowed, before it could become anything as honest as a whimper. Neither of them moved toward the other. Rowan sat in his own dark, listening to an animal that would not be touched, and understood with a clarity that felt almost cruel that he recognized this, not sympathized with it, recognized it, the way you recognize your own handwriting on a page you don't remember writing. He knew this particular refusal. He had lived inside it for 3 years, had built a cabin and a set of rituals and 11 exact steps to a bathroom door entirely in its service. Trust, once spent on the wrong thing, did not renew itself just because a new hand appeared, however gently it was offered. "Okay," he said finally, to no one, to both of them. "Okay." He did not reach again. He rose, slow and stiff, and retrieved a bowl of water, and set it down not beside the animal, but a full arm's length away, close enough to matter, far enough to not be a demand. Then he returned to the far side of the room, lowered himself into the chair he never sat in during the day, and let the silence between them stretch out unbroken, 2 wrecked and wary bodies sharing 4 walls, each one certain, in its own unspoken language, that the other could not be trusted, and neither one yet able to explain why some small, stubborn part of them had not simply walked away. Anh, từng bước chân tập đi cùng nhau, manh mối ẩn 201 xuất hiện. Trust did not arrive. It accumulated, the way rust accumulates, one imperceptible morning at a time. On the second day, Rowan did not attempt to touch the wound again. He set food down instead. Plain, unseasoned, the kind of food a body in pain could stomach, and retreated to the far side of the kitchen and waited. The growling had thinned by then into something more like vigilance, a low current running under the surface rather than a wall thrown up against him. He heard the animal eat only after he had been still and silent for the better part of 20 minutes, the sound of it careful and reluctant, chewing that stopped the instant Rowan shifted his weight in the chair, resuming only once the stillness returned. He learned to sit like that for hours. He had, after all, spent 3 years learning to make himself very small in rooms that felt too large. By the 4th day, the distance between the water bowl and the animal's chosen corner had shrunk by roughly a foot. Rowan measured it the way he measured everything, not with his eyes, which were of no use to him, but with the careful geometry of sound and smell, and the placement of his own bare feet against the floorboards each morning, cataloging what had shifted overnight, the way another man might read a weather report. The walking began by accident. He had gone to fetch water from the well behind the cabin, cane sweeping its familiar arc, and he heard the drag of claws on gravel behind him. Not close, not threatening, but present, a shadow of movement keeping a wide, careful berth. He did not turn, he did not speak. He simply continued his 11-step architecture out past its usual boundary, cane tapping ahead of him in the same unhurried rhythm he used indoors, and behind him, at a distance that felt deliberate, something limped along in his wake. It became, without either of them naming it, a ritual. Rowan walked his rounds, porch, the low wooden post he had never explained to anyone, and the animal followed, first at 30 feet, then 20, then near enough that Rowan could hear the particular unevenness of its gait, a hitch on the left side where the old wound had not yet finished healing. He never reached for it. He had learned, finally, the one lesson that had eluded him in every other part of his life since the blast, that some things could not be pulled toward you. They could only be given the space to arrive. It was on the 7th morning, hanging his old field jacket out to air after a week of rain had left the cabin damp, that something in the pattern broke. He heard it before he understood it, a sharp intake of breath behind him, animal, involuntary, followed by a stillness so absolute it was louder than any sound that had come before it. He turned toward the jacket, toward the source of whatever had just happened, and reached out instinctively, his palm brushing canvas gone soft with age, canvas that had not left its hook in 3 years, because Rowan had never found the courage to decide what to do with it. The dog was close now, closer than it had ever chosen to be, nose lifted toward the jacket, body rigid, ears, Rowan imagined, though he could not see them, pinned flat in a way that had nothing to do with fear of him and everything to do with something buried far deeper. A low sound rose from its chest, not a growl this time, something else entirely, something that cracked in the middle and did not resolve. Rowan's own breath caught to match it. He knew that jacket. He knew, with sudden, sickening clarity, what unit patch was sewn into its collar, what year was stitched inside the pocket, what the fabric had smelled like on the last day he'd worn it before the world went white and silent and stayed that way. His left hand found the sleeve and gripped it, knuckles pale, and for a long moment, neither the man nor the animal moved, both of them caught in the gravity of a smell that reached backward through years neither of them had spoken aloud. "Where did you come from?" Rowan said quietly, and it was not really a question, because some smaller, more honest part of him had already begun, against every instinct built over 3 careful years, to suspect the answer. The knock came on a Tuesday, 3 sharp raps that Rowan felt through the floorboards before he consciously registered the sound, and beside him, the dog he had still not named went instantly, completely still, the particular stillness of a body deciding, in a fraction of a second, whether stillness would be enough. "Mr. Voss?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar, pitched carefully between politeness and urgency. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name's Elena Rodriguez. I live down the county road, the blue house past the mill. I wouldn't have come, but I didn't know who else to ask." Rowan opened the door to the smell of rain-damp wool and something else beneath it, fear, held together with visible effort. He couldn't see her face, but he could hear the way her breath caught between sentences, the way a smaller set of footsteps shifted anxiously behind her, a child's weight rocking heel to toe. He heard, too, the low growl that rose immediately at his knee, and beneath it, the click of claws finding new purchase on the floor. Not retreat, the opposite. "There are men coming Thursday," Elena said, the words tumbling faster now that the door was open, faster than she'd clearly planned them. "From the bank. Well, not the bank exactly, a collection office. They sent someone in a uniform last week, some kind of enforcement contractor, and he told my daughter, he told her right to her face, that we'd be out on the lawn by the weekend if I couldn't." She stopped herself. Rowan heard her inhale, steadying. "I know you don't know me. I know this isn't your problem. I just heard in town that you used to be able to help with official things, papers, people who use uniforms to scare people who don't have anyone else." The growl beside him had climbed into something with an edge on it, low and continuous, aimed not at Elena's voice, but at the word she'd used, uniform, as though the syllables themselves carried a scent. Rowan's hand found the doorframe, gripping it the way his other hand had learned to grip the leash hook, the coiled leather, the sleeve of a jacket that still hung, untouched, 3 feet behind him. His own chest had gone tight in the old familiar way, breath narrowing, the small hallway suddenly smaller, and he was aware, distantly, as if observing another man's body, of the effort it took to keep his voice level. "Easy," he said, and he wasn't entirely sure which of them he was speaking to. The dog did not go easy. It surged half a step forward, a sound tearing loose from its chest that was not quite a bark and not quite a howl, something rawer than either, and Rowan felt the vibration of it through the floor, before he registered his own hand, dropping to find fur, to find the ridge of scar tissue along the ribs, an anchor point his fingers had learned by feel over 2 careful weeks. "He's not going to hurt you," Rowan said toward the porch, toward the woman and, he assumed, the small shape pressed close against her side. Then, quieter, meant only for the animal beneath his hand. Not now, not her. The growl did not vanish, but it dropped an octave, thinned at the edges, folded itself down into something contained rather than released. The same discipline Rowan had spent 3 years failing to master in himself, watching it, absurdly, arrive faster in an animal that had far more reason to abandon it. Elena's voice, when it came again, was smaller. "I can come back another time." Rowan stood in the doorway with his hand still resting on a dog that shook, almost imperceptibly, beneath his palm, and felt something shift in his own chest that had nothing to do with panic, a recognition, unwelcome and exact, that whatever had walked up his porch steps in the rain 2 weeks ago had not finished bringing trouble to his door. It had only just started. "No," he said. "Come in. Tell me what they're doing to your house." Behind him, low and steady now, The growl gave way to something that was almost quiet. Elena's story came out over coffee she barely touched, and Rowan listened the way he'd once listened to intelligence briefings, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, the places where her voice thinned or sped up, the truths she was editing down to something she could bear to say aloud. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, a construction accident, no insurance to speak of. She'd fallen behind on the house payments the way people fall behind. Not all at once, but in a slow accumulation of small failures. One missed month becoming two becoming a letter, the letter becoming a name. Halloran Recovery Solutions, a private collection firm the bank had sold her debt to without, as far as Elena could tell, any real obligation to explain itself. The man who'd come to her door the previous week hadn't worn a badge, not officially, but he'd worn a uniform, dark, official-looking. The kind of dark and official-looking that made people forget to ask whether it actually meant anything. He'd stood on her porch with a clipboard and told her 7-year-old daughter, directly, cheerfully, that they'd be sleeping in a motel by the weekend if Mommy didn't figure something out. His name's Dale Kessler, Elena said. He's not law enforcement. I looked it up after he left. He's a contractor the recovery firm hires to do the part they don't want their name attached to. Scaring people, standing too close, saying things that aren't quite threats so nobody can write them down as threats. Rowan had gone very still while she spoke, the old stillness, the useful one. And the town knows this. The town knows everything, Elena said, and her laugh had no humor in it at all. That's the part that gets me. I asked Mrs. Petrov at the grocery if she'd seen him around before. Turns out half the county's seen him around before. He's done this to 3 other families this year alone. The Alvarez place, the Whitfields, before they left. Everyone just... She stopped, searching for the word. Everyone just watches. Nobody wants to be the name on his clipboard next, so nobody says anything. And the ones who do talk about it, they talk about us, not him. About how I should have kept up with the payments. How maybe it's not so bad, moving somewhere smaller. Rowan recognized the shape of what she was describing before she'd finished describing it. Not from war, but from something older and just as familiar. The particular cowardice of a crowd that would rather agree with the man doing the harm than risk becoming the next target of it. He'd seen units do it too, on a smaller scale, in barracks and mess halls, silence spreading like a stain, because silence was safer than standing next to whoever'd just been singled out. He'll be back Thursday, Elena said, with people from the firm. Kessler said if the porch isn't cleared by then, they're within their rights to... She didn't finish that sentence either. Rowan sat with the weight of it, aware of the dog settling against his leg, no longer growling, but not fully at ease either, a low hum of tension still running under its stillness, the way current runs under still water. He thought about 11 exact steps to a bathroom door, about a cabin chosen precisely for its distance from other people's problems, about 3 years spent building a life that required nothing of him except his own survival. What does Kessler look like? Rowan asked. When you describe him, not his face, I can't use that, his voice, how he stands. What he does with his hands when he's trying to scare someone who won't scare easy. Elena hesitated, surprised by the question, and then, slowly, began to answer it. And somewhere in the middle of her description, in the particular way she said he gets louder when you don't flinch, Rowan felt something in his own chest shift from dread into something colder and more useful. Not violence, he had promised himself, in the ruins of the man he used to be, that he was finished with that particular currency. But there was more than one way to make a bully's clipboard stop mattering, and Rowan Voss had spent 20 years learning exactly how thin the difference was between a threat and a bluff, and how to tell, in the dark, which one he was facing. "Thursday," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Then we've got 2 days." Beside him, the dog lifted its head, ears, Rowan imagined, turning toward the door, toward Thursday, toward whatever version of a uniform was coming next. Thursday arrived the way bad weather arrives, announced for days, and still somehow a surprise when it finally broke. Rowan heard the trucks before Elena's daughter came pounding up his porch steps, breathless, words tumbling out faster than her small lungs could support them. "He's here. He's here already. Mama sent me. She said please. She said please come." And Rowan was moving before he'd finished deciding to move, cane in one hand, the other dropping instinctively to find fur that was no longer beside him. The dog had already gone. He heard it in the gravel, 4 feet striking earth in a rhythm he now recognized in his sleep. Already ahead of him, already running toward the one sound in the world it had spent 2 weeks learning to fear. The walk to Elena's house was 11 minutes by truck. On foot, blind, following a child's voice through unfamiliar terrain, it felt like an hour compressed into 4 minutes that did not behave like ordinary time. Rowan's chest had gone tight in the first 30 seconds and did not loosen. His breath came high and fast, catching somewhere behind his sternum, and some clinical, distant part of him, the part a VA counselor had spent 2 years trying to strengthen, recognized what was happening and could do nothing to stop it. Small space, uneven ground. A voice raised in anger somewhere ahead, indistinct but sharpening with every step. His hands remembered a rifle they hadn't held in years. His feet did not know this ground. Nothing about this was safe, and every cell in his body was screaming that fact at him in a language older than words. He kept walking anyway. The porch, when he reached it by sound and memory of Elena's directions, was a chaos of voices. Kessler's, loud, performing outrage for an audience of neighbors who had gathered at a careful, cowardly distance. Elena's, tight and controlled, refusing to move from her own doorway, and underneath both of them, a low, continuous sound that had stopped being a growl and become something closer to a held breath given shape. "Ma'am, I am asking you nicely to step aside from the rest of the sentence never finished, because that was the moment Dagger crossed some invisible line that existed only in the dog's own calculus, and the porch dissolved into a single, compressed second that would take Rowan the rest of his life to fully describe. No barking. That was the detail that would stay with him longest. No warning bark, no build, just a change in the air, a shift in weight, and Kessler's voice breaking into something high and startled as 80 pounds of trained, terrified, furious muscle closed the distance between threat and target in less time than it took Rowan to draw breath. Rowan's own body reacted before thought caught up. The old training surfacing whole and intact, a decade of muscle memory that had never actually left him, only slept. "Down," he said, and the word came out of him in a register he hadn't used in years, flat and absolute, the command voice of a man who had once been responsible for keeping living things from destroying themselves. It was not a plea, it was an order, given blind, into chaos, to an animal he had known for exactly 2 weeks. For one endless half-second, nothing happened. Then, the scrape of claws changing direction. The particular sound of a body arresting its own momentum mid-charge, muscles straining against instinct, Every fiber of an animal built for exactly this moment, forcing itself to stop a half a foot short of the man who'd frightened a child on a porch. Dagger did not retreat. He planted himself instead, low, rigid, a wall of trembling restraint between Kessler and the doorway, a growl rolling out of him steady and unbroken, every hackle raised, every line of his body a threat that required no follow-through to be understood. Kessler had gone very pale, clipboard forgotten, one hand raised instinctively in front of him, and it was Rowan's voice, not the dog's teeth, that finally broke the standoff. "You're on private property," Rowan said, walking forward now, with a steadiness he did not feel, Kane tapping ahead of him, his own breath still ragged, but his voice level, level, level. "You've got no papers that give you the right to be standing where you're standing. My dog knows that better than you do. I'd suggest you leave before he decides to enforce it." The crowd at the property line had gone utterly silent. Kessler left. Not gracefully, backing down the steps with his clipboard held in front of him like a shield, muttering something about lawyers that nobody bothered answering. But he left, and the trucks pulled away, and it was only once the gravel had gone quiet again that Rowan felt his knees threaten to give out beneath him, adrenaline draining out all at once and leaving something closer to wreckage in its place. Beside him, Dagger was shaking, a fine, full-body tremor that had nothing to do with cold, and Rowan knelt in the dirt and put both arms around him. No counting, no hesitation, no rituals at all, and held on until they had both, in their separate and private ways, stopped shaking together. That night, once Elena and her daughter had been walked home and the porch had gone quiet again, Rowan sat on the floor of his cabin with his back against the cold stove and Dagger's head resting heavy across his knee, and he finally allowed himself to ask the question he had been circling for 2 weeks. "I need to know," he said quietly, into the dark that was the same dark it always was for him. "I need to know if you're who I think you are." He had no way to ask a dog directly. He knew that. But he had spent 20 years learning that some questions weren't answered in words, and he reached instead for the one object in the cabin he had avoided touching since the night of the storm. The field jacket, still hanging on its hook, 3 years untouched, and he brought it down and laid it across his own lap. Dagger's reaction was immediate and total. The dog's whole body went rigid, head lifting off Rowan's knee, nose working the air in short, urgent pulls, and then, for the first time since Rowan had found him bleeding in the yard, a sound came out of him that was neither growl nor whimper, but something older than both, a low, broken note that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the ribs rather than the throat. He pressed his scarred side against the jacket, against Rowan's leg, against the man himself, with a force that was not aggression and was not fear, but something closer to a question finally being allowed to ask itself. Rowan's hands found the dog's head, cupping it the way he might once have cupped a compass, needing the contact to steady something that had started shaking in his chest. "There was a K9 in my unit," he said, and his voice came out low, careful, the voice of a man handling something that might still detonate. Name was Ranger, Belgian Malinois. Scar on his left side from a training accident 2 years before I ever met him. A blade mishap, they told us, healed wrong, left a ridge you could feel through his coat. His fingers, without his permission, found that exact ridge again now, tracing it the way he had 100 times over the past 2 weeks without ever letting himself finish the thought it kept starting. He went missing after the blast. Everyone told me he didn't make it. Told me there wasn't a body because there wasn't enough left to bring back one. I believed them because it was easier than the alternative. because looking for a dog felt like something a man with functioning eyes got to do, and I didn't have those anymore. And grief needed an ending, even a bad one, more than it needed the truth. Dagger made the sound again, quieter this time, and pressed his skull hard against Rowan's palm, and Rowan understood, not with proof, not with anything a court or a review board would accept, but with the same certainty he'd once used to read a room gone wrong in the dark, that there had been no accident with a blade. That somewhere in the 3 years between an explosion in a stairwell and a bleeding animal crawling toward a stranger's porch in a storm, a decorated K9 had been declared unfit, discarded through some quiet administrative failure, passed hand to hand, and finally to no hands at all, carrying a scar that matched a report Rowan had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. He did not weep, though something in his chest moved the way weeping might have. He sat instead with the jacket across his lap and the dog's head heavy under his hand, and let the twist settle into him slowly, the way truth does when it isn't shouted but simply, finally, allowed to be true. "You didn't die," Rowan said, very quietly, to the dark, to the dog, to the 20-year-old version of himself who had needed, badly, for someone to say it. "You didn't die, and neither did I. And for 3 years, we both let somebody else's paperwork decide that we had." Dagger, Ranger, exhaled, long and slow, the first full breath Rowan had ever heard him take, without some fraction of it held back in reserve, and settled his weight more completely against the man's side, as if two wrecked and separately grieving bodies had finally run out of reasons to keep the width of a room between them. Outside, the night had gone still. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, so had Rowan. News of Thursday's standoff traveled through the county faster than Rowan expected, and it traveled, as these things often do, in a shape entirely different from the one he'd lived through. By Saturday, 3 separate people had knocked on his door, a thing that had not happened in 3 years combined, each of them carrying some version of the same question. Is it true, what Kessler did to the Rodriguez girl? Rowan answered honestly each time, without embellishment, without the parts of the story that belonged to him alone, and each time he watched, through sound, through the shifting weight of someone's feet on his porch boards. Something in the visitor settled from curiosity into something closer to shame. It was Mrs. Petrov from the grocery who did the real work, in the end. She'd kept, it turned out, a small paper ledger behind her register for years, an old habit from a life before the store. Names, dates, small notes about who'd come through town looking rattled after a visit from a man in a dark uniform. She hadn't thought it mattered until Elena's daughter had cried in the cereal aisle 2 days after Kessler's visit, and something in Mrs. Petrov had finally decided that watching quietly wasn't the same as staying out of it. The ledger went to a county reporter by Monday. By Wednesday, it had become 3 other names besides Elena's: the Alvarez family, the Whitfields, a widower 2 towns over, each with the same contractor, the same clipboard, the same careful, deniable phrasing that skirted just under the line of an actual legal threat. Halloran Recovery Solutions dropped Kessler within the week, publicly, in the kind of statement companies write when they're more afraid of a headline than of the man they're disowning. Rowan heard later that Kessler had tried the same routine 2 counties over, and found, this time, that word had traveled ahead of him, doors that didn't open, a police non-emergency line that had started keeping a note of his license plate. No one hurt him. No one needed to. A man whose only real weapon had been other people's silence, found, eventually, that the silence had simply stopped being offered. The stranger transformation, to Rowan's ear, was the town itself. The same neighbors who had stood at Elena's property line 2 weeks earlier, watching and saying nothing, began showing up instead with casseroles and offers of help with the mortgage paperwork, with a county assistance program nobody had bothered mentioning to her until it became socially costly not to. Rowan recognized the shape of it without needing to see a single face, the particular, sheepish energy of a crowd correcting course, once the cost of staying silent had finally outweighed the cost of speaking. He didn't begrudge them the lateness. He understood, better than most, how long fear could keep a person from doing the thing they already knew was right. Elena came by on a Sunday afternoon, her daughter trailing behind her with something wrapped in foil, and sat on Rowan's porch step, the one he'd once refused to use, long enough to tell him, voice thick, that the county assistance program had approved her application, that the house was safe, at least for now, at least longer than a weekend. You didn't have to do any of it, she said. The porch, Kessler, any of it. Rowan sat with Ranger's weight solid against his leg, the dog's breathing slow and even for the first time in weeks, no tremor left in it at all, and thought about 11 exact steps and a leash hook at shoulder height, and 3 years spent believing that the only safe thing left to protect was himself. Turns out I did, he said. Just took me a while to remember how. Elena's daughter, small and unafraid in a way she hadn't been 2 weeks earlier, reached out and let her hand rest, briefly, on the ridge of scar along Ranger's side, the first stranger's touch the dog had allowed since the storm, and did not flinch when he leaned, just slightly, into it. The seasons turned the way they always had, except now Rowan noticed them differently, not through light, which remained forever closed to him, but through 100 small changes in sound and smell and rhythm that had, somewhere over the autumn, stopped feeling like a substitute for sight and started feeling like simply another way of seeing. The porch chair he'd never sat in got used every evening now, not by Rowan alone. Elena had taken to bringing her daughter over most Sundays, ostensibly to check on the house repairs that had, one small project at a time, become an ongoing collaboration rather than a single act of rescue. Rowan had built a ramp along the porch steps first, for no reason he could fully explain except that Ranger's hip still ached in cold weather, and somewhere in the building of it, with Elena holding boards steady and her daughter handing him nails one at a time with great and serious ceremony, the ramp had become the first of several projects that stopped being about any one household and started being about the widening shape of what Rowan was willing to call his. He still counted his steps. That hadn't left him, and he suspected, with the clear-eyed honesty 3 years of hard-won self-knowledge had finally given him, that it never fully would. But the 11s and 3s, and the exact turned angle of the coffee tin lid had stopped being the entire architecture of his life and started being simply one room in a house that had, without his quite noticing the moment it happened, grown considerably larger. Elena's daughter had taken to calling Ranger by a name of her own invention, Sergeant, delivered with the utmost seriousness, on the grounds that any dog brave enough to stand between her mother and a bad man deserved a proper rank, and Ranger, who still flinched at raised voices and still would not fully settle in rooms with more than one closed door, had begun, slowly, to seek the girl out on his own, resting his head in her lap during the long Sunday afternoons while the adults worked, patient, in a way that Rowan understood, now had nothing to do with training and everything to do with a body finally deciding, one small trust at a time, that safety was a real and repeatable thing rather than a temporary accident. The work itself mattered less, in the end, than the rhythm it built. Boards measured and cut. A fence mended along the property line separating Rowan's land from Elena's, not to divide the two households but, absurdly, to give the two dogs, because Elena's daughter had, over the autumn, acquired a small and enthusiastic mutt of her own, somewhere safe to run between them. Meals eaten on one porch or the other, depending on the week, with Rowan learning the particular geography of Elena's kitchen, the same patient way he'd once learned his own. 3 steps to the counter, the toaster always turned so the cord fell to the left. He did not call it family, not out loud, not yet. He was a careful man, and careful men did not name things before the naming had been earned. But there were mornings now, more of them than he could easily count, though he tried, out of habit, to count them anyway. When he woke to the sound of a child's laughter carrying faintly across the field between the two houses, and Ranger's tail moving against the floorboards at the sound of it, and Rowan lay still, in the dark that was permanent and unchanging, and for the first time in 3 years, no longer felt like a cell. The leash still hung on its hook by the door. He used it now, most mornings, walking Ranger down the county road, at a pace that no longer needed to be rushed, no longer needed to outrun anything. His left hand, when it found the leather, no longer closed around it white-knuckled and empty. It simply held what was there. There is a particular kind of grief that never announces itself as grief. It wears the shape of ritual instead, of 11 exact steps, of a coffee tin turned just so, of a leash left hanging on a hook that a man cannot explain and will not take down. It convinces you that control is the same thing as healing, that if you can only manage the size of your world precisely enough, the unmanageable part of it will eventually stop finding you. Rowan Voss had believed that for 3 years. He had built an entire life on the belief, board by board, ritual by ritual, in a cabin chosen for its distance from anyone who might ask him to feel something he hadn't scheduled. And it had taken a bleeding animal crawling out of a storm, an animal that had, in its own way, been just as sure that trust was a door that stayed closed forever once it had been slammed, to teach him the thing no counselor's office had quite managed to reach, that survival and forgiveness are not the same undertaking, and that a man can win the first without ever attempting the second. He had not chosen to be the one who lived. He understood that now, in a way that no longer required the word understood to be followed immediately by but. He had not failed Ranger by surviving him, because Ranger had not died at all, had simply been let go of, quietly, administratively, by people who mistook a wound for a verdict. And if that mistake could be undone, one patient month at a time, on a porch neither of them had believed they'd ever sit on again, then perhaps the guilt Rowan had spent 3 years mistaking for loyalty had never been loyalty at all. Perhaps it had only ever been an unfinished sentence, waiting for the two of them to finish it together. That, in the end, was the only lesson Rowan Voss would have offered anyone who asked, and no one did, because he was still, at heart, a private man in a house at the end of a long gravel road. But he thought it most mornings now, walking a leash that no longer needed to be gripped white-knuckled, past a fence he'd built to give 2 dogs somewhere to run, toward a porch where a woman and a child were already waiting with coffee and a place set for him. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday, 8 months later, on a phone Rowan rarely answered. The voice on the other end identified itself with a designation he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years, a string of letters and numbers that belonged to a unit he'd been told, more than once, no longer existed in any form that concerned him. The voice was polite, official. It used the word consultation, and then, more carefully, the phrase working K-9 program, and then carefully still, Ranger's old service number. The number Rowan had memorized without ever meaning to. The number stitched somewhere inside a jacket that still hung by his door. "We understand you may have information relevant to a program review," the voice said. "And we understand you may have found something that technically still belongs to the United States Marine Corps." Rowan sat with the phone against his ear, and Ranger's head heavy and warm against his knee, and Elena's laughter drifting faintly through the open window from the porch next door, and felt, for the first time in a long while, that old and familiar tightening begin low in his chest. Not fear this time, not entirely. Something closer to the sound a door makes when it is only beginning, carefully, to open.